and until very recently, I honestly believed my incredible life's work was finally complete. As the proud founder of a massive multinational logistics empire based right here in Chicago, I had spent the last 40 years relentlessly sacrificing absolutely everything to ensure my family's untouchable legacy. But last Tuesday, standing quietly in the dark, suffocating shadows of my own master bedroom closet, my entire world violently shattered. I silently watched my son Trent and his wife, calmly calculating the exact agonizing timeline of my impending death. They were eagerly discussing the $25 million corporate insurance payout they would receive the very moment my heart finally stopped beating. Before I fully explain how I narrowly escaped their sinister chemical trap and executed my total revenge, let me know exactly where you are watching this story from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever discovered a shocking betrayal from someone you blindly trusted with your own life. The violent wave of nausea hit me exactly as the crowded Red Line train violently lurched forward, departing the Roosevelt station. It was not a gentle, subtle sickness. It was a brutal, physically paralyzing agony that felt like shattered glass, aggressively grinding its way through my internal organs. A sharp, burning ache instantly radiated outward from the very center of my chest, traveling down my left arm and settling heavily into my trembling fingertips. The loud metallic screeching of the subway train's wheels against the heavy steel tracks echoed painfully inside my skull, amplifying the severe dizziness that threatened to drag me into total unconsciousness. I desperately squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the cold metal handrail beside my seat until my knuckles turned stark white. This was exactly how every single morning had begun for the past 3 agonizing months. I had officially stepped down as the active chief executive officer of Caldwell Logistics, proudly handing the massive operational reins over to my son Trent. I had genuinely believed the intense, suffocating pressure of managing global supply chains had simply finally caught up with my aging body. I had consulted the absolute best medical specialists in the entire city of Chicago. They ran endless, incredibly expensive batteries of diagnostic blood tests, exhaustive cardiac stress exams, and highly advanced neurological scans. They found absolutely nothing. Every single highly paid physician simply patted my shoulder and completely dismissed the terrifying agony as severe anxiety and the natural, unavoidable deterioration of old age. They politely told me to simply go home and rest. I forced my tired eyes open consciously, trying to steady my ragged, shallow breathing. The subway car was packed with morning commuters, all completely lost in the glowing digital screens of their smartphones, or staring blankly out the smeared, dirty windows. Directly across the narrow aisle from me sat an elderly man. He was wearing a thick, heavily worn wool coat and a faded flat cap. His weathered face was deeply lined with profound, heavy wrinkles, carrying the unmistakable, hardened look of an Eastern European immigrant who had survived a very hard life. His dark, sharp eyes were not looking at his phone. They were intensely, unblinkingly fixed directly onto my left wrist. I instinctively pulled my arm closer to my chest, suddenly feeling incredibly self-conscious under his intense, heavy scrutiny. I was wearing a massive, incredibly heavy luxury timepiece. It was a striking, incredibly rare limited edition Swiss chronograph that Trent had proudly gifted to me for Father's Day shortly after his major executive promotion. He had explicitly insisted I wear it every single day as a physical symbol of our powerful corporate dynasty. It was easily worth more than most luxury sports cars. The elderly man leaned forward abruptly, completely ignoring the cramped, limited personal space of the crowded subway car. He did not ask for my permission. His hand shot out with incredibly surprising, completely unexpected speed and firmly grabbed my left wrist. His grip was shockingly strong, his calloused fingers digging painfully into my fragile skin. I flinched violently, a surge of adrenaline completely cutting through the terrible nausea. "Take it off now," he demanded. His voice was a harsh, guttural rasp, heavily accented with a thick, undeniable Russian inflection. He was not making a polite suggestion. He was issuing a desperate, urgent order. "I see what is inside the casing. What are you doing?" I snapped defensively, violently, yanking my arm back with a sudden surge of angry strength. "Get your hands off me. This is an incredibly rare, completely priceless gift from my only son. You do not touch it." The old man did not retreat. He did not apologize for his aggressive, shocking behavior. Instead, he leaned even closer, his dark eyes burning with a grim, terrifying intensity that absolutely chilled my blood. His voice dropped into a harsh, commanding whisper that completely cut through the loud, ambient noise of the moving train. "I am a master horologist," he stated slowly, articulating every single heavy syllable with absolute, undeniable precision. "I spent 50 years expertly building and meticulously repairing the most complicated mechanical timepieces in the entire world. I know the exact specific weight and the precise balance of a genuine Swiss movement. That heavy watch on your wrist is a completely hollowed-out casing. It is not functioning machinery." He reached into the deep pocket of his worn wool coat and quickly produced a tiny, specialized metal tool. He held it up, the sharp silver tip catching the harsh fluorescent light of the subway car. "Open it right now in front of me," he demanded softly, his expression completely unyielding. "Open it right now, or I promise you, you will not physically live to see the end of this month." The sheer terrifying conviction radiating from his dark eyes completely paralyzed me. The terrible burning pain radiating through my chest suddenly felt much sharper, far more sinister. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my mind violently rejecting the impossible, horrific implication of his aggressive words. This was a loving gift from Trent. It was a symbol of his deep respect. But the agonizing daily sickness had mysteriously begun almost exactly the same week I had started wearing the heavy metal band tightly against my skin. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I clumsily unclasped the thick leather strap and handed the heavy timepiece over to the stranger. The old man handled the expensive luxury watch with absolute, complete irreverence. He did not admire the flawless diamond-encrusted bezel. He simply flipped it over, wedged the tiny, sharp metal tool perfectly under the microscopic seam of the thick backplate, and expertly applied pressure. There was a sharp, distinct metallic pop, the heavy back casing cleanly detached, falling into his calloused palm. He silently held the open watch up so I could clearly see directly inside. My breath caught sharply in my tight throat, and my heart hammered violently against my aching ribs. There were absolutely no delicate, intricate Swiss gears inside. There were no tiny, perfectly balanced springs or complex moving mechanical parts. The entire internal cavity of the incredibly expensive watch was completely, entirely empty. Instead of machinery, a strange, spongy, highly absorbent metallic pad was firmly wedged tightly against the interior metal backing. It was slowly, continuously oozing a thick, foul-smelling, distinctly grayish gel. The dark chemical substance was specifically designed to press directly against the permeable surface of my skin, slowly and consistently absorbing straight into my fragile bloodstream every single minute I wore the loving gift from my son. I practically sprinted off that train the second the doors opened at the downtown station. The freezing Chicago wind whipped across my face as I climbed the concrete stairs to the street level, but I barely felt the cold. The heavy throbbing nausea that had plagued me all morning was entirely swallowed by a blinding white-hot adrenaline. I bypassed the hospital completely. I did not need a doctor right now. I needed the truth, and I knew exactly where to find it. I marched down the busy sidewalk, clutching the gutted metallic shell of the watch in my coat pocket. The sharp chemical odor of that gray gel seemed to cling to my fingers, burning my nostrils with every breath I took. Within 10 minutes, I was standing in the towering glass lobby of Caldwell Logistics. This was the empire I had built with my bare hands, the company I had sacrificed my youth and health to secure for my family. The security guards nodded at me with deep respect, but I ignored them. I stepped into the private executive elevator and hit the button for the top floor. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. echoing the heavy mechanical clanking of the elevator shaft. I was a father walking into a confrontation I never could have imagined in my worst nightmares. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. I strode past the reception desk, completely ignoring Trent's startled executive assistant. She tried to call out my name, but I pushed open the heavy double doors of the corner office without knocking. Trent was sitting behind my old custom mahogany desk, looking over a financial report. He wore a crisp navy suit, looking every bit the confident, successful chief executive I had groomed him to be. He looked up, his brow furrowing in mild surprise as I stormed across the plush carpet. Before he could even say a word, I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the dismantled watch, and slammed it down violently onto the polished wood right in front of his face. The metal casing rattled loudly against the desk, exposing the spongy chemical-soaked pad hidden inside. I leaned forward, planting my palms flat on his desk, my chest heaving as I stared him down. I demanded to know exactly what this was. I demanded to know why the inner gears of a luxury Swiss timepiece had been ripped out and replaced with a leaking, foul-smelling substance. I demanded answers, and I told him he had exactly 10 seconds to start telling me the truth before I called the police. I fully expected him to panic. I expected him to stammer, to look away, or to show some visible sign of guilt. Instead, my son remained unnervingly calm. He did not flinch. He did not break eye contact. He simply looked down at the ruined watch, let out a slow, heavy sigh, and leaned back in his leather executive chair. The sheer coldness of his reaction sent a sharp chill straight down my spine. He did not look like a man who had just been caught committing a terrible crime. He looked like a disappointed manager dealing with a difficult employee. He calmly reached forward and pressed a button on his desk intercom. He asked his assistant to find his wife and send her in immediately. He released the button and looked back at me, his expression softening into a look of deep, patronizing pity. He told me to sit down and catch my breath. He said I was working myself into a dangerous state and that I needed to calm down before I had a heart attack. I refused to sit. I stood there, my hands trembling, with a mixture of raw fury and creeping physical exhaustion, waiting for whatever twisted excuse he was about to deliver. A few moments later, the office door opened and Monica hurried inside. She was dressed impeccably in a gray tailored skirt suit, looking every bit the polished former pharmaceutical researcher she was. She took one look at my pale face, then looked down at the dismantled watch on the desk. Instead of shock or fear, a look of profound, gentle concern washed over her features. She rushed to my side with a warm, deeply comforting smile, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. She used smooth, practiced medical jargon, explaining the situation with perfect clarity. She told me that the gray substance was not anything dangerous. She claimed it was a completely harmless, highly advanced conductive hydrogel attached to a microscopic experimental biometric sensor. She explained that her old pharmaceutical development firm was currently testing this transdermal patch to monitor severe blood pressure fluctuations and cardiac irregularities in real time. She looked deeply into my eyes, her voice filled with emotional sincerity. She said my health had been failing so rapidly since my retirement, and the doctors had been absolutely useless. They were terrified that I was going to suffer a fatal stroke while living alone in my large house. Monica continued her flawless explanation, her tone soothing and entirely rational. She admitted that they had hidden the biometric microchip inside the back of the watch because they knew exactly how proud and stubborn I was. They knew I would have flatly refused to wear a bulky medical monitor or admit that my health was genuinely declining. The hydrogel, she explained, simply acted as a conduit to read my pulse through the skin, transmitting the data directly to a private medical server for constant observation. It was a lie spun with absolute perfection, tailored precisely to address my symptoms and exploit my vulnerabilities. Trent stood up from his desk and walked over to me. He gently took both of my trembling hands in his own. His eyes grew wide and glassy, welling up with tears that looked entirely authentic. He squeezed my hands tightly and spoke with a voice thick with raw emotion. He told me that he had already lost his mother 5 years ago, and that the pain of her sudden death still haunted him every single day. He looked at me, his face a portrait of desperate devotion, and said he simply could not survive losing me too. He apologized for the deception, swearing they only did it out of profound, overriding love and a desperate need to keep me safe. Hearing my son invoke his dead mother shattered the protective wall of fury I had built around myself on the train ride over. The raw emotion in his voice was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. A heavy, suffocating wave of guilt immediately washed over me, pushing down the sickening nausea that still lingered in my stomach. I looked from my son to my daughter-in-law, feeling a sudden deep sense of shame for doubting my own flesh and blood. How could I have accused them of something so vile? They were not trying to harm me. They were just frightened children trying to protect their aging, increasingly frail father. The lie was brilliantly weaponized, with the illusion of family love completely neutralizing my anger. I let it go now. That evening I placed the heavy timepiece inside the top drawer of my nightstand, sliding it completely out of sight. I told Trent and Monica the experimental hydrogel was giving my skin a burning rash, and I needed a short break from the monitor. They reluctantly agreed, though the smile on her face seemed stiff as she advised me to put it back on as soon as the irritation subsided. I spent the next 4 days resting in the quiet comfort of my empty house, doing absolutely nothing but reading old business journals. What happened next was nothing short of miraculous. By the second morning, the crushing weight in my chest began to lift. By the third day, the violent nausea that usually greeted me at dawn had entirely vanished. On the fourth morning, I woke up feeling a profound sense of clarity. The dense, suffocating fog clouding my brain for 3 long months was completely gone. I felt exactly like myself again. I felt like the relentless executive who had built a massive logistics empire from scratch. My physical energy returned, my natural appetite recovered, and my exhausted hands finally stopped their constant shaking. It was a deeply terrifying realization. The doctors had confidently blamed my rapid decline on natural aging, but they were entirely wrong. My illness was directly tied to the watch. To be absolutely certain, I had to test my deeply unsettling hypothesis. I needed to know if my gut feeling was just the paranoid rambling of a sick old man or a dark, undeniable reality. On Friday night, with a heavy, trembling heart, I took the watch out of the drawer. The faint chemical smell of the gray gel wafted up, making my stomach churn in immediate anticipation. I strapped the cold leather firmly around my wrist, ensuring the spongy pad pressed directly against my skin. I went to sleep, dreading the morning. When I woke up 12 hours later, the physical result was immediate and completely devastating. The entire room violently spun around me the exact moment I tried to sit up in bed. A sickening wave of crippling vertigo sent me crashing back down onto the mattress. My chest pulled so tight it felt like a heavy steel vice was slowly crushing my lungs, and a bitter, highly acidic taste flooded the back of my throat. The physical agony had returned with a terrifying vengeance, completely validating my absolute worst fears. The biometric sensor story was a meticulously crafted lie. I ripped the watch off my wrist, throwing it across the dark room. I lay there desperately gasping for air, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs, realizing that my own flesh and blood was somehow directly responsible for this ongoing torment. I decided to keep my horrific discovery a secret. I needed to watch them closely to see the truth hiding behind their smiles. The perfect opportunity arrived the very next evening during our traditional Sunday family dinner. Trent and Monica came over to my house bringing a freshly roasted chicken and an expensive bottle of imported red wine. I forced myself to play the role of the frail, rapidly deteriorating father perfectly. I intentionally dragged my feet across the floor, slurred my words slightly, and kept my posture constantly hunched and defeated. I purposely wore a loose-fitting shirt with long sleeves just to hide the fact that my wrist was completely bare. As we sat around the large mahogany dining table, Monica poured the wine, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she asked about my declining health. I decided it was time to finally drop the bait. Midway through the main course, I let out a sudden loud gasp, clutching my chest tightly with one hand, while violently sweeping my other arm across the wooden table. My trembling hand slammed into my crystal wine glass, sending it crashing violently to the hardwood floor. Dark red wine splattered everywhere, permanently staining the expensive wool rug. I slumped heavily forward in my dining chair, groaning loudly, pretending to be overcome by a severe, blinding dizzy spell. I kept my eyes half closed carefully, watching their instant reaction through my eyelashes. A normal, loving son would have immediately jumped up in absolute panic. A caring daughter-in-law would have rushed to my side or frantically called for an ambulance. But they did neither. Instead of showing genuine fear, I caught a fleeting, microscopic expression perfectly displayed on her face. She did not gasp in shock. She did not reach out to help me. She simply shot Trent a cold, incredibly impatient glare. She let out a sharp sigh of profound annoyance, then slowly turned her wrist to casually check the time on her own watch. It was the distinct look of a bored woman who was tired of waiting for a late train to arrive. Trent remained firmly seated, staring at me with a blank, calculating emptiness. The lack of human empathy in that completely silent exchange chilled my cold, aging soul far more than the physical pain ever could. They eventually helped me safely back to the living room sofa. The carefully constructed mask had slipped just enough for me to clearly see the ruthless monsters hiding underneath. I spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through every interaction, every signed contract, and every business decision I had made since handing over the company. The next morning, the true depth of their agenda arrived at my front door. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy front doorbell rang loudly. I shuffled slowly to the entrance, still perfectly playing the role of a weakened old man. Trent stood on my porch, but he was not alone. Standing next to him was a lawyer named Thomas Bradley. I had never met the man, but I recognized the briefcase and the confident smile immediately. Trent pushed his way into my foyer, guiding the lawyer directly into my living room without asking for my permission. They spread a massive stack of legal documents across my coffee table. Trent turned directly to me, his voice adopting a patronizing, falsely gentle tone. "Dad, we really need to talk about your fragile future," he said smoothly. "Your cognitive decline is getting noticeably worse every single day. The terrifying incident at dinner last night proved that you are rapidly becoming a dangerous liability to yourself. You are losing your mind. Dad and I need to legally step in to completely protect our family trust while you rest and recover." The lawyer Thomas Bradley loudly clicked his pen and tapped the towering stack of crisp white papers. "This is a comprehensive financial and medical power of attorney," the lawyer explained in a highly practiced, completely emotionless voice. "It transfers all executive decision-making, banking access, and medical directives directly to your son. Sign this immediately, Mr. Caldwell, and let Trent shoulder the heavy burden of your estate." The incredibly aggressive, highly orchestrated push to completely strip away my remaining assets and firmly strip me of my legal autonomy set off a deafening, terrifying chorus of alarm bells deep in my mind. They were closing the net. The heavy gold pen hovered just inches from my face. Thomas Bradley held it out with a practiced, predatory smile, his perfectly tailored suit practically screaming of expensive, billable hours. Next to him, my son Trent leaned over the mahogany coffee table, lightly tapping the signature line on the thick stack of legal documents. "Come on, Dad." Trent murmured, his voice dripping with an artificial, syrupy sweetness that made my skin crawl. "It is just a simple signature. It will take 10 seconds, and then you can finally rest without worrying about the company, the bank accounts, or the medical bills. I will handle absolutely everything for you, I promise." I sat frozen on my own living room sofa, my heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribcage. The sheer audacity of their ambush was breathtaking. They had boxed me into a corner both physically and psychologically, positioning themselves between me and the hallway. The thick stack of papers rested dangerously close to a large, steaming mug of black coffee I had poured for myself just moments before they arrived. I stared down at the crisp white pages, my mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. If I flatly refused to sign, if I kicked them out, and demanded they leave me alone, Trent would immediately use that as concrete evidence of my supposed cognitive decline. He would march straight to a judge, claim I was paranoid and combative, and force a hostile conservatorship. I would be locked away in a facility before the week was over, and the thallium would be replaced by whatever chemical cocktail Monica decided to prescribe. I needed an exit strategy, and I needed it right this second. I realized with a cold, sharp clarity that the only way out of this trap was to play directly into their narrative. They wanted to believe I was a weak, rapidly deteriorating old man. I was going to give them a performance they would never forget. I let out a weak, ragged sigh, forcing my shoulders to slump heavily forward. I deliberately made my breathing sound shallow and labored. "You are right, Trent," I whispered, keeping my eyes cast downward in feigned defeat. "I am just so terribly tired lately. I cannot seem to focus my mind. Show me where you need my name." Trent exchanged a swift, triumphant look with the lawyer. The smug satisfaction radiating from my son was absolutely nauseating. Bradley stepped closer, eagerly pointing the heavy gold pen toward the dotted line. "Right here, Mr. Caldwell," Bradley said smoothly. "Just press firmly." I reached out my right hand, but I did not take the pen. Instead, I channeled every ounce of energy in my body into generating a sudden, violent tremor. My fingers began to shake wildly, vibrating with aggressive, uncontrollable spasms. I let out a frightened, confused gasp, deliberately sweeping my trembling arm directly across the surface of the coffee table. My heavy forearm slammed forcefully into the side of the ceramic mug. The scalding hot black coffee launched into the air like a dark, destructive wave. It crashed directly onto the center of the legal documents, instantly soaking through the pristine white pages. The dark liquid pooled rapidly, dissolving the black ink and ruining the meticulously prepared power of attorney in a matter of seconds. I let out a loud theatrical cry of dismay, clutching my shaking hand to my chest, pretending to be utterly terrified by my own sudden lack of physical control. What followed was the most revealing, horrifying moment of my entire life. For one fraction of a second, the carefully constructed mask of the loving, concerned son completely shattered. Trent leaped back to avoid the splashing coffee, and the expression that contorted his face was one of pure, unadulterated hatred. His eyes narrowed into dark, venomous slits, and his upper lip curled into a sneer of absolute disgust. He looked at me not as a father, but as a repulsive, inconvenient insect that he desperately wanted to crush beneath his heel. "For Christ's sake, you clumsy old fool, Trent," hissed the words escaping his mouth with a violent, venomous intensity. The silence that followed was deafening. The air in the living room seemed to freeze solid. Trent instantly realized his fatal mistake. He blinked rapidly, physically, shaking his head as if trying to reset his character. Within the span of a single heartbeat, the vicious predator vanished, and the deeply concerned son miraculously reappeared. "Oh, Dad, I am so sorry." Trent stammered quickly, reaching out to grab a handful of napkins from a nearby side table. "I did not mean to snap at you. I am just stressed out from work. Are you burned? Did the hot coffee burn your skin?" I kept my head down, pretending to whimper in confusion, but my mind was crystal clear. I had seen the monster hiding behind his eyes. I had seen the absolute truth. Thomas Bradley let out a frustrated, highly unprofessional sigh as he stared down at the ruined coffee-soaked documents. "The pages are completely destroyed, Trent," the lawyer muttered, lifting a dripping, brown-stained sheet of paper with his fingertips. "We cannot submit these to the county clerk under any circumstances. We need a completely fresh set of signatures." Trent gritted his teeth, visibly struggling to maintain his calm, comforting facade. "It is okay," Thomas Trent said softly, though the muscles in his jaw were twitching furiously. "We will just head back to the downtown office and print a brand new batch of documents. We can come back tomorrow morning to finish this properly." He turned to me, placing a gentle, entirely fake hand on my shoulder. "You just rest today, Dad. We will handle this tomorrow when your hands are feeling a bit more steady. Do not worry about a single thing." I nodded weakly, burying my face in my hands, playing the role of a humiliated broken man to absolute perfection. I listened closely to the sound of their leather shoes retreating across the hardwood floor. I heard the heavy front door open and eventually click shut. I waited exactly 30 seconds in absolute breathless silence. Then I slowly stood up from the sofa. The manufactured weakness instantly drained from my muscles. My hands were no longer shaking. My posture straightened, and I walked purposefully across the living room to the front entrance. I engaged the heavy brass deadbolt, sliding it into place with a loud, satisfying metallic clunk. I turned around and stared at the empty, quiet house. The deep gut feeling had evolved into a terrifying certainty. I was being actively hunted in my own home. The people I loved were conspiring to end my life. I had no allies left within my family. I was entirely alone, completely isolated on an island of their making. But they had forgotten who I truly was. I was no longer a victim waiting to die. This absolute betrayal forced me to finally rely on my old, incredibly ruthless business instincts to survive their vicious and highly orchestrated corporate execution. The war for my empire had now officially begun, and I would win. I waited until the sound of Trent's car completely faded down the street before I moved from the front door. The silence of my house felt suffocating, but I knew I did not have the luxury of sitting around to process the betrayal. I needed undeniable proof of what was inside that watch. My first instinct was to drive straight to the premier research hospital in downtown Chicago, where I had been treated for the past 3 months. But I quickly stopped myself. Monica was a former pharmaceutical researcher with extensive connections throughout the city's medical district. If I walked into a major hospital claiming I was being poisoned, there was a high probability someone in the network would immediately alert her. She could intercept the lab results or manipulate the attending physicians into dismissing my claims as severe dementia. I could not risk it. I needed absolute secrecy. I needed an independent facility that operated completely off the grid, far away from my daughter-in-law's sphere of influence. I went to my closet and pulled out a small lockbox where I kept emergency cash. I stuffed several thick stacks of $100 bills into my coat pocket. I bypassed my usual luxury sedan and took the keys to an old, unassuming pickup truck I kept in the garage for gardening supplies. I backed out of the driveway and headed toward the outer suburbs of Chicago, taking the back roads to avoid traffic cameras and toll booths. The drive took just over an hour, the bleak winter landscape flashing past my window as my mind raced with dark, terrifying thoughts. I finally pulled into the parking lot of a sterile, unmarked concrete building tucked away in a quiet industrial park. This was a private forensic toxicology laboratory, a facility primarily used by independent investigators and private defense attorneys who needed discreet, unquestionable chemical analysis. It was exactly what I needed. I parked the truck in the very back corner of the lot and pulled my coat collar up high against the freezing wind. I walked through the heavy glass doors into a stark, brightly lit reception area that smelled faintly of antiseptic and bleached floors. There were no comfortable waiting room chairs or friendly receptionists. A thick pane of bulletproof glass separated the front desk from the main laboratory area. A tall, serious-looking technician in a white lab coat stepped up to the glass partition, eyeing me with mild suspicion. I did not offer my real name or my corporate title. I simply slid the gutted watch across the stainless steel counter, placing it right next to a small, sterilized vial of my own blood that I had carefully extracted in my bathroom earlier that morning. I need a comprehensive, expedited chemical analysis of the substance inside this watch casing, I said, keeping my voice low and steady. And I need a full toxicology screen run on the blood sample to see if that exact substance is currently present in my system. The technician frowned, looking at the strange metallic pad wedged into the back of the luxury timepiece. He asked for my identification and insurance information to start the intake paperwork. I shook my head firmly and pulled the thick stacks of $100 bills from my coat pocket. I am paying entirely in cash, I told him, sliding the money across the cold counter. I do not want any digital records, no insurance claims, and no names attached to this test. I just need the absolute truth about what is inside that metal casing." The technician looked at the cash, then back up at my pale, sweating face. He seemed to recognize the sheer desperation in my eyes, silently nodding as he scooped up the money and the evidence. He carried the watch over to a stainless steel workbench in the main laboratory and placed it carefully under a high-powered digital forensic microscope. I watched through the thick glass partition as he leaned in to examine the gray, foul-smelling gel that had been pressing against my skin for 3 agonizing months. The technician stared through the lenses for only a few seconds before his entire posture suddenly stiffened. He quickly pulled back from the eyepiece, his eyes wide with genuine alarm. Without saying a single word, he immediately turned around and grabbed a heavy pair of thick blue hazardous material gloves from a nearby dispenser. He snapped them onto his hands with practiced urgency and carefully placed my watch into a transparent, hermetically sealed biohazard containment bag. My heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs as he walked back over to the glass partition. His previous professional detachment was completely gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling gravity. "I need 48 hours to run this through the mass spectrometer to give you an exact, undeniable molecular breakdown," he said, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. "But based on the crystalline structure and the distinct corrosive reaction on the metal casing, I can tell you right now that this is not a medical device. Whatever this is, it is highly volatile and extremely dangerous. Do not put this near your skin again. If you have been wearing this for an extended period, you are incredibly lucky to still be standing here." A cold, suffocating dread washed over me. I thanked him, took the claim ticket, and walked out of the laboratory on trembling legs. The winter wind hit my face, but I felt absolutely numb. The gut feeling was no longer just a dark suspicion. It was a terrifying, scientifically validated reality. I sat down in the cold cabin of the pickup truck for a long time, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white. My own son and his wife had engineered a slow, excruciatingly painful execution. They had smiled, poured my wine, and pretended to care while poisoning me for financial gain. The urge to drive straight to the police station and demand their arrest was overwhelming, but I knew I could not do that yet. I did not have the official mass spectrometer results. If I tipped my hand too early, Trent would use his immense corporate resources to bury the evidence and destroy my credibility. I had to be the ruthless, calculating businessman I used to be. I started the engine and began the long, agonizing drive back to my house. I knew exactly what I had to do. I had to return to my home and continue to play the dying, oblivious, pathetic father. I had to swallow my absolute rage and smile at the people trying to murder me to avoid arousing any of Trent's suspicions. I pulled into my driveway as the sun began to rapidly set. I walked through the front door, intentionally dragging my feet and slumping my shoulders to project utter weakness. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard Monica's voice coming from my kitchen. I took a deep breath, buried the searing fury deep inside my chest, and completely prepared to act like a man who had absolutely no idea he was fighting for his very life. I walked into the kitchen, my hands shoved deep into my pockets to hide their intense trembling. Monica was standing right by the marble island, casually pouring a glass of filtered water, as if she owned the place. She turned and flashed that deeply artificial smile, telling me she had used her spare key to drop off fresh groceries because she was so profoundly worried about my frail condition. I nodded weakly, thanking her for her supposed kindness. I complained of a blinding migraine shuffling past her toward the staircase, desperate to get her out, before I lost my temper. She lingered for only a few agonizing minutes before finally leaving, the heavy front door clicking shut behind her. The second her luxury car pulled out of the driveway, I rushed to my private study and locked the solid oak door. I knew I had a very narrow, rapidly closing window of time. If they were actively planning to end my life, I needed absolute, undeniable surveillance of my own home to catch them in the act. I pulled out my secure burner phone and dialed a number I had not used in over 2 decades. I called Sarah Jenkins. 20 years ago, Sarah was the absolute best corporate espionage security contractor in the entire Midwest. Whenever a rival logistics firm tried to steal my supply chain secrets or plant listening devices, Sarah was the phantom I hired to aggressively turn the tables. She was ruthless, brilliant, and operated entirely in the shadows. Her voice was just as crisp and guarded as I remembered. I did not waste any time with pleasantries or polite catch-ups. I told her I was in a desperate, horrifying situation, that my life was in active danger from my own family members, and that I needed comprehensive, completely undetectable surveillance installed in my personal residence immediately. I offered her triple her usual exorbitant rate, provided she could do it quietly and without leaving a single trace behind. She agreed without hesitation, instructing me to leave the side door of my garage unlocked at exactly 8 o'clock the following morning. I spent a restless, miserable night tossing and turning in the dark, terrified that Trent and Monica might unexpectedly return while I was still unprotected and highly vulnerable. The next morning, the garage door clicked open with barely a whisper. Sarah slipped inside like a ghost, wearing dark clothing and carrying a heavy reinforced duffel bag. We exchanged a brief silent nod. She asked no probing questions about my pale complexion. She simply went straight to work. I pointed her toward the main living room and my private study, the two specific locations where Trent and Monica always insisted on holding their impromptu, hushed family meetings. Sarah opened her bag, revealing a highly sophisticated array of micro cameras, audio transmitters, and specialized wiring tools. She immediately zeroed in on the tall, cylindrical air purifiers sitting innocently in the corners of both rooms. She expertly dismantled the sleek plastic casings, carefully embedding the tiny high-definition lenses directly into the digital display panels of the machines. The cameras were incredibly advanced, capable of recording crystal-clear video and capturing faint whispers from across the room, all while transmitting the encrypted data directly to a secure remote server. She worked with astonishing speed and absolute precision, her hands moving with the steady confidence of a master surgeon. We were modifying the air purifier in the living room when the piercing chime of the front doorbell suddenly echoed through the house. I froze, staring at Sarah in paralyzing panic. She killed the power to her soldering tool and signaled for absolute silence. I crept slowly toward the front window, peering cautiously through the very edge of the heavy velvet curtains. It was Monica. She was standing on the front porch holding a large insulated thermal container, casually checking her reflection in the glass panel of the front door. She had returned completely unannounced. If she walked into the living room and saw Sarah surrounded by exposed wires and dismantled machinery, my entire survival plan would be instantly destroyed. Trent would know I was actively investigating them, and they would undoubtedly accelerate whatever lethal toxic timeline they had planned for me. I looked back at Sarah. She was already rapidly packing her specialized tools away, shoving the delicate components into her duffel bag with silent, frantic urgency. I knew I had to boldly intercept Monica and buy Sarah enough time to escape. I ruffled my hair, unbuttoned my shirt, and took several ragged breaths to mimic physical distress. I unlocked the deadbolt and slowly pulled the door open, blocking the entrance with my body. Monica smiled brightly, eagerly holding up the thermal container. "I brought you some healthy homemade soup, Dad," she chirped, her voice dripping with that sickeningly fake, overly sweet affection. "I know you have not been eating well, and this has all the right nutrients to help aggressively build up your failing strength." I let out a harsh, agonizing cough, leaning heavily against the wooden doorframe, as if I could barely support my own physical weight. I thanked her weakly, reaching out with a trembling hand to take the container, but I intentionally kept my arm braced rigidly across the doorway. She tried to step forward, her eyes darting curiously over my shoulder toward the dark, quiet hallway. "I really need to come inside and heat it up for you," she insisted, pushing gently but firmly against the heavy door. I groaned loudly, clutching my chest with my free hand, completely blocking her path. I told her I was incredibly tired, that I had a terrible blinding fever, and that I just desperately needed to lie down alone in the dark. She frowned, clearly frustrated by my unexpected resistance. I could clearly see the cold, ruthless calculation flashing in her eyes as she tried to accurately assess whether I was truly sick or actively hiding something from her. Behind me, hidden deep in the shadows of the house, I heard the faint, almost imperceptible sliding of the back window being carefully pushed open. Sarah was making her desperate escape. I coughed again, much louder this time, doubling over and resting my sweaty forehead against the cool doorframe. "Please, Monica." I wheezed, projecting pure, pathetic vulnerability to distract her. "Just leave the soup with me. I cannot handle any bright lights or loud conversation right now." She stared at me for a long, agonizing moment, her jaw tightening visibly with suppressed, furious irritation. Finally, she let out a dramatic, overblown sigh of feigned sympathy. She aggressively thrust the container into my trembling hands. "You really do look awful, Harrison," she murmured coldly, completely dropping the affectionate title of Dad she loved to use. "Eat the soup. It is exactly what you need to finally rest." She turned on her heel and marched swiftly down the concrete driveway without looking back. I closed the door and locked it tightly, leaning my heavy back against the solid wood as a cold sweat drenched me entirely. I locked the door tightly, leaning my back against the solid wood as cold sweat drenched me. I stayed there for several minutes, listening to the profound silence of the house. The thermal container in my hands felt like a bomb waiting to detonate. I carried it to the kitchen and poured the thick liquid straight down the garbage disposal. I washed the container with scalding water, making sure no trace of the soup remained. As I dried my trembling hands, my secure burner phone vibrated softly in my pocket. It was an encrypted text message from Sarah. She was out, and the surveillance feeds were live. I breathed a sigh of relief. The first phase of my counterattack was securely in place, but surveillance alone was not enough to save me. I needed to understand the true motive behind their lethal timeline. To do that, I had to look at the money. I spent the remainder of the evening carefully setting the stage. I turned off the lights, leaving only a dim lamp in the hallway. I shuffled up the wooden stairs, making my footsteps drag, in case Monica had planted listening devices or instructed Trent to drive past. I went into my room, changed into pajamas, and climbed into the large bed. I left a small crack in the curtains so anyone watching from the street would assume I was bedridden and asleep. I lay perfectly still for 2 agonizing hours, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the wind. When I was absolutely certain the neighborhood was dead, I silently slipped out from under the blankets. I crawled across the carpet to the far corner of my large closet, pulled back a loose baseboard, and retrieved a small, hidden digital tablet. I had secretly purchased this device months ago when my symptoms first began hiding it out of a paranoid instinct I could not quite explain. Now it was my lifeline to the outside world. I sat cross-legged on the floor, pulling a heavy blanket over my head to mask the bright digital glow of the screen. I powered on the tablet and connected to a hidden encrypted cellular network. I navigated to the login portal for Caldwell Logistics. When I handed the chief executive title to Trent 18 months ago, I surrendered all my access keys, fobs, and passwords. I wanted him to feel the true weight of leadership. I wanted him to command the empire I had bled for 40 years to build. But I was not a fool. I had secretly embedded a backdoor administrative code directly into the architecture of the corporate servers. It was a master skeleton key that bypassed all standard security protocols, firewalls, and 2-factor authentication checkpoints. I never told Trent about it. I never told the board of directors. It was my ultimate fail-safe, a ghost protocol designed to monitor the health of my life's work. I typed the complex string into the terminal and pressed enter. The screen went black for a terrifying second before the familiar dashboard of the Caldwell Logistics Master Financial Database materialized. The sheer volume of data was overwhelming, but my instincts were razor-sharp. I bypassed the sanitized executive summaries and profit reports Trent presented to the board. Those were just polished fiction. I dove straight into the raw general ledgers. I needed to see the actual flow of capital. The moment I opened the operational expense accounts, a massive financial black hole stared back at me. The numbers simply did not align with reality. Over 8 months, the company had hemorrhaged an astronomical amount of cash. I frantically scrolled through thousands of line items tracing the digital paper trail. Trent had systematically authorized dozens of massive recurring phantom invoices. These payments were supposedly for international freight consulting software integration and overseas customs expediting. But the vendor names were completely unfamiliar. I ran a background trace on 3 of the largest recipients. They were empty shell companies registered to vacant post office boxes in offshore tax havens. Trent was not just mismanaging the company, he was actively embezzling millions of dollars. The sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking, but it did not explain his terrifying desperation to secure my power of attorney that morning. If he was already stealing millions undetected, why did he need total legal control over my personal estate? The answer hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The embezzled cash was only the tip of a much darker iceberg. I backed out of the operational ledgers and forced my way into the secured asset portfolio. I opened the registry for our distribution warehouses scattered across the Midwest. These facilities were the beating heart of Caldwell Logistics. I had spent decades purchasing the land and constructing those buildings in cash, ensuring the company carried zero commercial debt. When the loading screen populated the asset data, the breath was knocked from my lungs. Every single warehouse had been secretly leveraged. Trent had taken out massive high-interest illicit loans against the total equity of our entire real estate portfolio. He had used the company's physical foundation as collateral for loans acquired from shady private equity groups known for ruthless lending tactics. I sat trembling in the suffocating darkness of my closet, the glowing screen illuminating the tears of pure rage streaming down my face. I rapidly calculated the staggering debt obligations against the vanishing cash reserves. The math was brutally clear. Trent had not just stolen from Caldwell Logistics. He had completely gutted it from the inside out. He had dug a financial grave so deep that recovery was impossible. The crushing weight of the high-interest loan payments was accelerating exponentially. I stared at the projected default dates, my heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. The logistics empire I had sacrificed my youth, my health, and my marriage to build was exactly 3 weeks away from complete bankruptcy. The entire grand illusion finally made perfect, terrifying sense to me. Trent did not just want my personal wealth. He desperately needed it to cover his tracks. The company was on the verge of total collapse, and when the predatory lenders came to collect their collateral, the massive offshore embezzlement would be hopelessly exposed. He would go to federal prison for several decades. He needed my power of attorney to quietly liquidate my stock portfolios, empty my personal trust funds, and sell this house to magically plug the massive holes in the corporate ledgers before the authorities noticed a single thing. And he needed me to die quickly, so I could never review the financial wreckage or testify against him. The thallium in the watch, the fake medical sensors, the aggressive push for total legal control, it was all part of a frantic cover-up. I slowly closed the tablet, the screen fading back to black. The sad, sick old man was now truly dead. I wiped the tears from my face and stood up in the dark. My son wanted to play a ruthless game of corporate survival. I was going to show him exactly how I had built an empire in the first place. The digital clock on my bedside table glowed a faint green in the suffocating darkness, reading exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. I was still sitting cross-legged on the floor of my closet, the heavy blanket draped over my head, staring at the financial ruin of my life's work on the glowing tablet screen. My mind was furiously calculating legal strategies when the unmistakable sound of a key sliding into the front door deadbolt echoed through the silent house. The brass lock clicked open with a loud thud that sent a jolt of pure ice straight down my spine. My heart leaped into my throat. No one else had a key except Trent and Monica. They had let themselves in during the dead of night, slipping into my personal sanctuary while they assumed I was unconscious and defenseless. Panic, raw and primal, threatened to paralyze me, but the ruthless business instincts that had just been fully awakened inside me took immediate control. I killed the power to the tablet in a fraction of a second, plunging the closet into total darkness. I shoved the heavy blanket aside and scrambled across the plush carpet as quietly as possible. I could hear the faint sound of the front door softly closing, followed by the quiet click of the deadbolt being re-engaged from the inside. They were locking us in together. I reached the edge of my large bed, lifted the heavy mattress with trembling fingers, and shoved the digital tablet deep underneath the box. Pushing it as far toward the center as my arm could reach. I frantically threw myself under the thick down comforter, pulling the heavy blankets up to my chin. I instantly forced my body into the rigid, curled posture of a sick, rapidly failing old man. I closed my eyes just as the subtle, agonizingly slow creak of the wooden staircase began to sound. Someone was creeping up the steps, placing their weight carefully to avoid making too much noise. Every single footstep felt like a physical blow to my chest. The adrenaline surging through my veins was absolutely deafening, roaring in my ears like a rushing river. I had to consciously force my breathing to slow down, mimicking the shallow, slightly labored rhythm of a deeply comatose, heavily medicated patient. I let my mouth hang slightly open and relaxed the muscles in my face, completely surrendering to the physical illusion of vulnerability. The footsteps reached the second-floor landing. I heard the soft rustle of expensive fabric and the faint, familiar scent of Monica's imported floral perfume drifting into my bedroom. The brass handle of my bedroom door turned with an excruciatingly slow squeak. A thin sliver of pale yellow light from the hallway spilled across the dark carpet, slowly widening as the door was pushed open. I kept my eyes completely shut, my eyelids relaxed, but my other senses were operating at maximum capacity. Two distinct sets of footsteps entered the room. They moved with a predatory, silent grace, gliding across the floor until they were standing mere inches from the edge of my mattress. I could feel their presence looming over me, a dark, suffocating energy radiating in the cold air. "Is he actually asleep?" Trent whispered, his voice so incredibly low and close that I could feel the faint vibration of his breath against the stagnant air of the room. "He is completely out cold," Monica replied, her tone clinical, detached, and utterly devoid of human empathy. I severely doubled the dosage of the muscle relaxants in his evening tea before we left earlier today. His central nervous system is currently so suppressed, he would not wake up if we fired a gun in this room. Just focus on finding the documents. We have an incredibly narrow window before the bank opens tomorrow morning. I felt the mattress shift ever so slightly as Trent leaned over me. The proximity was physically nauseating. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to open my eyes, to grab him by the throat, to demand answers for the devastating financial destruction he had caused. My fists clenched involuntarily beneath the heavy blankets, my fingernails biting painfully deep into my palms. I forced myself to release the tension, to keep my hands completely limp, to maintain the flawless performance of a dying man. I slowed my breathing even further, letting out a soft, ragged snore to reinforce the deeply tragic illusion. I heard the soft metallic sliding of the top drawer of my wooden nightstand being carefully pulled open. They were searching right next to my head. The quiet rustling of papers and the shifting of small objects echoed loudly in the tense silence of the room. Trent was desperately looking for my personal checkbooks, my physical banking tokens, and the small leather journal where I foolishly kept my private passwords written down. He was looking for the final keys to drain my personal estate, the last desperate life raft to plug the massive bleeding hole he had created in the corporate logistics ledgers. "I cannot find the master password journal anywhere," Trent hissed in a frustrated, frantic whisper. "It is supposed to be right here in the top drawer. I saw him put it here last week. Where did the crazy old fool hide it?" "Just keep looking," Monica commanded smoothly. "Check the bottom drawer. Check beneath the bedside lamp. We absolutely need those specific routing numbers to initiate the massive offshore wire transfers tomorrow afternoon. If we do not successfully liquidate his personal trust funds by the end of the day, those predatory equity lenders will immediately seize the commercial warehouses. The entire corporate facade will instantly collapse Trent. You need to find those account numbers right now. He is deteriorating so fast it is pathetic, Trent muttered, the sound of a drawer clicking shut, punctuating his cruel words. Look at him, Monica. He is literally wasting away into nothing. It is the only logical solution, Trent, Monica replied, her voice dropping into a chilling, perfectly rational register. The thallium absorption is doing its job beautifully. The continuous transdermal exposure completely mimics natural accelerated neurodegenerative failure. The doctors at the hospital are already entirely convinced it is a rapid onset aggressive dementia combined with total organ shutdown. He will not last another week. By the time his heart finally gives out, the autopsy will simply confirm natural age-related cardiac arrest. We just need to legally secure his assets before he takes his very last breath. The absolute terrifying certainty of their lethal timeline washed over me like a bucket of freezing ice water. He will not last another week. They had given me a strict, unavoidable expiration date. They were standing over my supposedly comatose body, casually discussing my imminent murder, as if they were reviewing a mundane quarterly financial projection. The sheer, unadulterated evil of my own flesh and blood was a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. I focused entirely on the rhythmic, slow rise and fall of my lungs, actively suppressing the violent urge to scream. I had to remain an absolute, completely invisible ghost in the dark. I waited in the dark after their footsteps retreated. I listened as the front door clicked shut, and Trent's engine faded into the silent night. Only then did I dare to open my eyes. The cold sweat on my skin felt like a shroud. I was alone again, but the silence of the house no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a tomb they had already prepared for me. They had a timeline. I had less than 7 days before they expected my heart to give out. I climbed out of bed, my mind racing through the dark reality of my situation. I spent the night pacing my bedroom, running through every possible scenario, legal maneuver, and counterattack I could launch before my body succumbed to whatever toxin they had strapped to my wrist. I needed undeniable scientific proof. I needed the final piece of the puzzle to drop into place. That critical piece arrived exactly 2 days later. I was sitting in my locked study staring at old family photographs when the burner phone hidden in my drawer began to vibrate. The jarring buzz shattered the quiet tension in the room. I snatched the device, staring at the blocked caller identification on the screen. It was the private forensic toxicology laboratory in the suburbs. I took a deep breath and pressed the phone against my ear. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to the same technician I had met 48 hours earlier. His tone was strained, lacking any of the detached professional distance he had maintained during our initial encounter. He demanded that I confirm my identity using the random numerical code he had assigned to my cash transaction. I recited the numbers perfectly. I heard him let out a long, heavy sigh before he began to speak. He told me he had run the chemical sample through the mass spectrometer multiple times because he simply could not believe his initial results. The gray, foul-smelling gel hidden inside the metallic casing of the luxury timepiece was not an experimental biometric sensor. It was not a harmless conductive hydrogel designed to passively monitor cardiovascular fluctuations. It was a highly concentrated, lethally weaponized transdermal delivery system. The technician paused for a fraction of a second, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. The primary active ingredient suspended within the synthetic gel, he explained, was a heavy metal known as thallium. The harsh word hung in the cold air between us, heavy and incredibly final. I had briefly heard of it before, but the context was always tied to old espionage novels or historical assassinations. The technician proceeded to carefully break down the horrifying reality of the substance with clinical precision. Thallium, he told me, is historically referred to by toxicologists as the poisoner's poison. It is a highly toxic heavy metal that is completely tasteless, absolutely odorless, and incredibly difficult to detect in standard hospital blood screens unless the attending physician knows exactly what to look for. But the most terrifying aspect of the chemical compound they had engineered was its sinister delivery method. By suspending the heavy metal in a permeable hydrogel and pressing it directly against the thin skin of my wrist, they had bypassed the human digestive system entirely. The thallium absorbed continuously into my bloodstream every single second I innocently wore the watch. The technician explained that chronic low-dose thallium poisoning meticulously mimics the natural symptoms of age-related deterioration. It aggressively attacks the central nervous system, causing the exact type of peripheral neuropathy, violent tremors, and crippling physical exhaustion I had been experiencing. It severely ravages the gastrointestinal tract, producing the blinding nausea and intense vertigo that plagued my mornings. And ultimately, it systematically shuts down the major bodily organs, leading directly to an inevitable, seemingly natural cardiac arrest. The sheer diabolical brilliance of the murder plot was staggering. Ordinary criminals could never have successfully engineered something this chemically sophisticated. This specific method required highly specialized knowledge, unfettered access to restricted laboratory compounds, and a deep understanding of human physiology. It required a trained pharmaceutical researcher. It required Monica. She had maliciously used her medical background and professional connections to flawlessly synthesize the perfect, untraceable murder weapon. She had calculated the exact dosage required to bring a grown man to his knees without triggering a sudden acute toxicity alarm. She had designed the gel to silently break down my body at a highly controlled pace, giving Trent just enough time to panic me into signing over my financial estate before I died. The narrative they had smoothly spun for the doctors at the research hospital was a masterpiece of lethal misdirection. They had painted a tragically believable picture of an aging executive rapidly succumbing to natural dementia and organ failure, seamlessly hiding their dark, toxic sabotage behind a flawless facade of family concern. I ended the call with the forensic laboratory, my hand shaking so violently I nearly dropped the burner phone onto the hardwood floor. I walked heavily over to my desk and pulled open the deep bottom drawer. The gutted metallic shell of the luxury Swiss watch lay there in the deep shadows, looking like a harmless, discarded piece of jewelry. I stared down at it, a massive wave of profound sorrow washing over my soul. This was the incredibly expensive, beautifully wrapped gift my son had proudly handed to me on Father's Day. He had smiled warmly, hugged me tightly, and told me how much he loved me while strapping a sophisticated, slow-acting execution device directly onto my wrist. They were not just trying to steal my personal fortune. They were not just trying to push me out of the logistics empire I had spent decades building. My own son and my supposedly caring daughter-in-law were methodically, slowly murdering me in plain sight. Every single day I wore that beautiful symbol of supposed family devotion, I was actively participating in my own assassination. The agonizing, heartbreaking sadness burning in my chest was eclipsed by a rising tide of pure rage. They had underestimated the man they were dealing with. They had mistakenly confused my unconditional paternal love for foolishness and my physical illness for mental weakness. They actually believed I was simply a clueless, failing old man who would quietly fade into the dark and freely hand over the keys to his kingdom. But they had failed. They had confidently given me a fatal timeline, but they did not realize I had uncovered their exact hidden playbook. I knew exactly how they were quietly stealing millions from the logistics company, and I possessed undeniable scientific proof of their calculated attempted murder. I forcefully closed the heavy desk drawer and locked it with a click. I no longer had the emotional luxury of mourning the loyal son I thought I had raised. I desperately needed to prepare for absolute, uncompromising, total war. I would happily let them blindly believe they were completely winning. I would patiently let them walk right into this quiet house, eagerly expecting to plan a funeral. But they were soon going to face a very different, deeply terrifying reality. I waited until the house settled into silence before moving. My mind shifted into freezing clarity. I retrieved the digital tablet from beneath the floorboards. I needed to see what happened downstairs while I pretended to be comatose. I sat on my mattress, draped a comforter over my shoulders, and booted up the secure application. The encryption keys loaded flawlessly. Within seconds, the remote server connected. The dashboard displayed 2 active video feeds. I tapped the living room feed and rewound to 2:30 in the morning. The infrared video snapped into focus. The hidden camera angle provided a perfect, unobstructed view. I watched the screen as my son and daughter-in-law walked down the staircase and moved into the frame. They walked directly to my mahogany liquor cabinet. Trent grabbed a bottle of my rare, expensive vintage scotch. I watched in cold disgust as he poured 2 massive glasses, handing one to Monica, before collapsing onto my leather sofa. They sat drinking my prized scotch, looking like triumphant vultures. I turned the volume on the tablet all the way up. The highly sensitive audio transmitters picked up their voices with terrifying clarity. Trent took a long, desperate swallow of the liquor and leaned his head back. He looked exhausted, his face drawn and pale. He ran a shaking hand through his hair and let out a miserable sigh. "We are running out of time, Monica?" Trent whispered, his voice trembling with desperate panic. "The bank is going to notice the empty accounts by the end of the month. The commercial loans are already in default. The corporate cash reserves are completely gone. Every single operational dollar is gone." Monica took a slow, elegant sip of her drink. "You just need to keep your nerve, Trent," she replied, her tone smooth and cold. "We have the power of attorney documents ready. As soon as his heart gives out, the entire estate transfers to your control. We liquidate the personal trust funds, sell this house, and quietly backfill the corporate accounts before the board of directors realizes a dime is missing. It is a flawless plan." "I cannot stop panicking," Trent hissed abruptly, leaning forward and gripping his glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. "You do not understand the sheer magnitude of this disaster, Monica. It is exactly $15 million. $15 million of critical operational corporate capital completely vaporized into thin air." I stared at the screen, my breath catching painfully in my throat. $15 million. That was a staggering, incomprehensible sum of liquid cash to disappear soon from the logistics company ledgers. I listened closely as Trent began to unravel his desperate confession, pouring out into the quiet room. He admitted that he secretly wired the $15 million to a series of underground, unregulated cryptocurrency exchanges operating out of Eastern Europe. He convinced himself he was a financial genius, attempting to aggressively multiply the company assets in a matter of weeks to step out of my imposing shadow. But the digital markets violently crashed. His leveraged positions were liquidated overnight. The money was completely wiped out in an instant. But the horror did not stop there. Trent kept talking, his voice dropping an octave filled with unadulterated terror. He confessed that in a blind panic to recover the lost millions, he turned to illegal offshore gambling syndicates. He used the physical company warehouses as collateral to secure massive high-interest loans from incredibly dangerous underground lenders. He desperately bet the borrowed money on illegal sportsbooks, hoping for a miraculous windfall to save his life. He lost absolutely every single bet he placed. "They are not just bankers," Monica Trent pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "These lenders are tied directly to the mob. They do not care about corporate restructuring. They care about their money. They called me twice yesterday. They told me that if they do not receive the first massive installment by next Friday, they are going to send people to my office. They are going to physically break my legs, Monica. They will take the company, and then they will take our lives." I bled the entire logistics empire dry. I watched the video feed, a profound, chilling silence filling my bedroom. The sheer reality of my son's actions was staggering. He was not a ruthless corporate mastermind trying to orchestrate a hostile takeover. He was a weak, incredibly stupid boy who played a dangerous game with money he did not earn, and he lost spectacularly. He gambled away 40 years of blood, sweat, and sacrifice on imaginary digital coins and illegal sports bets. And when the violent consequences of his monumental stupidity arrived at his doorstep, his immediate solution was to slowly murder his father to pay off his mob debts. Monica slowly set her crystal glass down on the heavy coffee table. She reached out and firmly grasped Trent by the shoulders, forcing him to look directly into her dead eyes. "Listen to me very carefully," she commanded, her voice devoid of human warmth. "You are not going to lose your legs, and we are not going to lose our lifestyle. The old man is fading rapidly. The heavy metal toxicity is severely compounding every day. His central nervous system is collapsing, and his heart muscle is critically weakened. He will be dead by Wednesday. Thursday at the absolute latest. Once he is in the ground, his millions are ours. We pay off the syndicate, we fix the corporate ledgers, and we walk away clean. You just need to keep playing the grieving son for a few more days." Trent stared at her, tears of pathetic relief welling up in his eyes. He nodded weakly, pulling her into a desperate embrace. "Thank you," he whispered against her shoulder. "I do not know what I would do without you. I just need him to die. I just need him to die right now." I slowly powered down the tablet, the glowing screen fading into complete blackness. I sat in the dark closet, the heavy silence of the house pressing against my ears. My own son was praying for my immediate death to save himself from the violent criminals he had invited into our lives. My daughter-in-law was clinically calculating my exact time of expiration. The profound sorrow I felt earlier was entirely consumed by calculating absolute resolve. They wanted my fortune to save their miserable lives. They wanted me to pass away in the night so they could inherit the keys to the kingdom. But I was not a victim, and I was not going to die on their convenient schedule. I had built a massive empire by destroying anyone who tried to take what was mine. I was going to turn their meticulously planned murder plot into a devastating, inescapable trap. They desperately needed my money by next Friday to avoid the violent wrath of the mob. I was going to make absolutely certain that when Friday arrived, they would have nothing but empty hands and a cage of their own making. The game was no longer about survival. It was about total, uncompromising destruction. I sat perfectly still in the suffocating darkness of my closet. The tablet screen cast a pale, ghostly light out across my trembling hands. I thought I had already heard the absolute worst of their sinister plot. I thought the revelation of the illegal gambling debts and the impending corporate bankruptcy was the absolute bottom of this treacherous abyss. But the video feed was still running. The digital timestamp in the lower corner of the screen silently ticked forward, and the hushed conversation in my living room continued to unfold. Monica leaned back against the plush leather cushions of my sofa, swirling the amber liquid in her crystal glass. She looked incredibly annoyed, her delicate features twisting into a mask of pure frustration. "He is taking far too long to die. Trent." Monica stated, her voice slicing through the quiet room with the chilling precision of a surgical scalpel. The initial calculations were based on a much faster absorption rate. His cardiovascular system is surprisingly resilient for a man of his age. We cannot afford to wait around for nature to take its course, while those lenders are breathing down our necks. Tomorrow morning, before you go to the office, you need to swap out the hydrogel pad inside the watch casing. I have already prepared a new batch in my private lab. I severely increased the thallium concentration. It is a massive dosage. Once that touches his skin, his nervous system will rapidly collapse. He will lose all motor function by tomorrow evening. Trent nodded slowly, staring blankly into his empty glass. He did not look horrified by his wife discussing chemical murder. He just looked incredibly impatient. "We just need his signature on that power of attorney document first," Trent replied, his voice completely devoid of any filial affection. "I will aggressively push the lawyer to bypass the standard notary protocols if I have to. Once we have his signature legally securing my complete executive control, we toss him straight into that private nursing home facility on the north side. They ask absolutely no questions, and their nursing staff is notoriously negligent. We isolate him in a private room and simply let the heavy metal finish the job entirely out of sight. No more exhausting family dinners. No more playing the dutiful, concerned children. We just lock the heavy door and permanently walk away. Monica smiled, a thin, deeply predatory curve of her lips. And then the real financial payout finally triggers, she murmured smoothly. Exactly. Trent breathed out, his eyes suddenly lighting up with a greedy, feverish intensity. As soon as his heart finally stops, the corporate contingencies automatically activate. The board of directors mandated a key man life insurance policy on him 15 years ago when the massive logistics empire was rapidly expanding. He is fully insured for exactly $25 million. And as the sole remaining heir and the acting chief executive, that staggering amount of money flows directly into a blind corporate trust that I completely control. $25 million of untraceable, perfectly clean liquid capital dropping straight into my lap. Trent leaned much closer to Monica, his voice trembling with manic, desperate excitement. We take the massive insurance payout and immediately wire the initial $15 million directly to the criminal syndicate. We clear the disastrous underground gambling debts completely. We take the remaining $10 million, quietly liquidate whatever physical warehouse assets are left before the federal auditors arrive, and we absolutely disappear. We catch a private charter to Europe by the end of the month. We can start completely over in Monaco or the south of France. We will never have to look back. My father dying is our absolute financial salvation. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal slammed into my chest like a physical freight train. I had to consciously force myself to breathe. My lungs felt terribly tight, burning with the suffocating realization of my own true value to my only child. My life, my 40 years of relentless sacrifice, my unconditional love. It all boiled down to a $25 million insurance payout. I was not a beloved father to him. I was simply a highly lucrative corporate asset waiting to be violently liquidated. I was a walking, breathing lottery ticket that he was actively trying to safely cash in. I watched my son kiss his wife on my sofa, celebrating their impending wealth, completely intoxicated by the prospect of my imminent demise. They genuinely believed they had thought of absolutely everything. They had the perfect untraceable poison, the perfect financial motive, and the perfect international escape plan. They simply assumed I was just a frail, pathetic old man, blindly stumbling into an early grave. They arrogantly thought my entire legacy was theirs to freely pillage. I slowly reached out and tapped the digital screen, permanently terminating the live video feed. The sudden silence in the closet was absolutely deafening. I sat in the pitch-black darkness, a profound, terrifying calm suddenly settling over my exhausted mind. The burning rage that had previously consumed me completely evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating, and razor-sharp focus. I was a man who had successfully built a massive empire by completely outsmarting the most ruthless corporate sharks in the entire logistics industry. I knew exactly how to dismantle a hostile opponent piece by piece until they had absolutely nothing left to leverage. And Trent had just foolishly handed me his entire operational playbook. He desperately wanted the legal power of attorney. He selfishly wanted the massive corporate insurance money. He cowardly wanted to flee to Europe and live comfortably like a king on the bloody spoils of my chemical execution. I was going to willingly let him believe his sinister plan was working absolutely perfectly. I would eagerly give him the grand illusion of total victory right up until the final, devastatingly irreversible moment. I carefully pulled the glowing tablet back into my lap and securely reopened the highly restricted corporate network portal. I smoothly bypassed the main operational ledgers and dug directly into the deeply hidden human resources and insurance administrative files. I needed to quickly verify the exact legal terms of the key man policy Trent was so desperately relying on. I found the dense legal document buried deep within the digital archives of the corporate server. I slowly read through the remarkably complex contractual stipulations, carefully scanning the tiny fine print with the highly practiced speed of a seasoned executive. The policy was indeed entirely valid, and it would absolutely pay out exactly $25 million immediately upon my certified death. However, Trent had fundamentally misunderstood a critical, incredibly important underlying corporate legal structure. The primary beneficiary of the massive policy was not my arrogant son. The exclusive, legally binding beneficiary was the logistics company itself. And as the absolute majority shareholder and original founding owner, I still securely possessed the unilateral, unquestionable authority to legally rewrite the entire corporate trust structure at any given moment. I was going to completely lock him out of every single penny, safely protecting my legacy while simultaneously setting his devastating trap. I would now become the ruthless hunter. The rest of the night passed in cold calculation. When dawn crept through the gaps in my velvet curtains, the agonizing heartbreak that had paralyzed me was gone. In its place was an unbreakable block of pure ice. I climbed out of the closet, returning the digital tablet to its hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. I smoothed the comforter back over the mattress, ensuring my sickbed looked exactly as disheveled as a dying man would leave it. I walked into the master bathroom and splashed freezing water onto my face. Staring into the mirror, I did not see the frail victim my son wanted me to be. I saw the founder of Caldwell Logistics. I saw a man who had survived hostile takeovers and vicious supply chains. Trent and Monica had foolishly assumed my paternal affection, made me blind and weak. They were about to learn that the same ruthlessness I used to build my empire was now entirely focused on their destruction. I waited until 9 in the morning, listening intently as Trent and Monica prepared for their day downstairs. I heard the front door close and the hum of their luxury vehicles fading down the driveway. As soon as the house was empty, I retrieved my secure burner phone and dialed a restricted federal number I kept committed to memory. I called Special Agent Thomas Sterling. 15 years ago, when an international smuggling ring attempted to infiltrate my eastern seaboard shipping routes, Thomas was the lead investigator assigned to the case. We had worked closely together to dismantle the entire criminal operation. I respected his sharp intellect, his uncompromising moral compass, and his absolute discretion. When he answered the phone, his voice was crisp and professional. I bypassed the standard pleasantries. I told him I had uncovered a massive corporate embezzlement scheme tied directly to underground offshore syndicates, and that it was intimately connected to an active attempted murder. I told him the primary suspect was my son. Thomas instructed me to meet him at a secure, unmarked federal facility on the industrial outskirts of the city. I dressed in layered clothing, slipped out the back door, and drove my oldest vehicle to the rendezvous point. Thomas was waiting for me in a sterile, windowless briefing room. He looked older, his hair dusted with gray, but his eyes were just as piercing as I remembered. I sat down across the metal table and began to empty my briefcase. I systematically laid out the nightmare my life had become over the past 48 hours. First, I handed him the encrypted flash drive containing the raw Caldwell Logistics server logs, detailing the $15 million Trent had stolen and incinerated on unregulated cryptocurrency exchanges and illicit gambling platforms. Next, I placed the forensic toxicology report on the table outlining the weaponized thallium delivery system disguised as a biometric watchpad. Finally, I handed him a secondary drive containing the hidden camera footage of Trent and Monica, calculating the exact timeline of my chemical execution and their subsequent corporate insurance payout. Thomas sat in stunned silence as he reviewed the mountain of evidence. He read the toxicology report twice, his jaw tightening with disgust. He plugged the flash drives into a secure offline terminal and watched the living room footage. The sheer sociopathic cruelty radiating from Monica and the greedy desperation dripping from Trent filled the small room. When the video ended, Thomas slowly removed his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at me with a mixture of professional shock and deep personal sympathy. "Harrison," he said, his voice quiet. "We have more than enough probable cause here to authorize a heavily armed tactical raid on your residence and the corporate headquarters this afternoon. We can have your son and your daughter-in-law in federal custody before the sun goes down. They will face decades behind bars for grand larceny, wire fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. We can easily end this terrible, exhausting nightmare for you right now and legally ensure they rot in a concrete cell for the rest of their miserable, empty lives. I stared into the federal agent's eyes, my expression unreadable. No, I replied, my voice steady and cold. I do not want an immediate quiet arrest behind closed doors. I do not want them spirited away in the middle of the night. If we arrest them today, Trent will spin the narrative. He will play the victim. He will hire expensive lawyers and try to claim the mob forced his hand. He will try to preserve his unearned dignity. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat against the cold metal table. I want them to fall from the highest possible pedestal. I want them to feel the intoxicating rush of total victory. I want them to firmly believe they have completely outsmarted me, secured the massive insurance payout, and successfully stolen my entire empire. I want them to stand proudly in the blinding spotlight of their supposed triumph right before I rip the entire world out from beneath their feet. I want this to be a public, flawless, and utterly devastating retaliation. Thomas studied my face for a long, tense moment. He understood exactly what I was asking for. It was incredibly risky and completely outside standard federal protocol, but he also understood the profound, unforgivable magnitude of the betrayal I had suffered. He slowly nodded his head. All right. Harrison Thomas agreed, his tone shifting into sharp, tactical precision. If we are going to do this your way, we need to orchestrate a highly controlled federal sting operation. We will let them proceed with their timeline, but we will control the entire environment. We will monitor every single digital communication wire transfer and physical movement. But you must understand the severe physical risk you are taking. You cannot stop wearing that watch, or they will instantly know you suspect something. You have to endure the thallium exposure for a few more days while we set the stage. Are you absolutely certain your body can handle the toxicity until Friday? I thought about the blinding nausea, the agonizing tremors, and the terrifying weakness that gripped my limbs every morning. I thought about the invisible heavy metal slowly shutting down my vital organs, inching me closer to the cold grave my own son had eagerly dug for me. I am absolutely certain I lied smoothly, projecting a physical strength I did not truly possess. We will schedule an emergency meeting of the corporate board of directors for this coming Friday. Trent desperately needs me to publicly sign the power of attorney documents, to appease the aggressive mob lenders, and secure his illegitimate executive control. I will tell him I am finally ready to surrender the entire company and hand over my massive estate. We will let him gather the board, the corporate lawyers, and the major shareholders in the main executive boardroom. We will let him stand at the head of the table and claim his bloody crown. And then, right when he truly believes he has finally won absolutely everything, we will spring the trap and destroy him completely. I left the secure federal facility with a renewed sense of purpose burning in my chest. Special Agent Thomas Sterling walked me to the exit, his final words echoing in my mind as I stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. The drive back to my house felt distinctly different this time. The crushing weight of absolute betrayal was still present, but it was now firmly anchored by the cold certainty of inescapable justice. The federal sting operation was officially active. Undercover surveillance teams were already quietly tapping into the corporate network, meticulously monitoring Trent's frantic offshore wire attempts and silently watching the dangerous mob-connected lenders lurking in the shadows. My only remaining job was to flawlessly play the tragic dying king and expertly deliver my treacherous son directly into their waiting, fully prepared hands. I parked my vehicle in the dark driveway, walked slowly through the heavy front door, and immediately felt the sickening, debilitating physical toll of the thallium aggressively coursing through my fragile veins. My cold hands shook violently, and a massive wave of severe nausea aggressively forced me to grip the wooden hallway table for physical support. The toxic heavy metal was doing exactly what Monica ruthlessly intended it to do. I did not have to artificially pretend to be a physically broken, rapidly deteriorating man. I simply had to harness that authentic, agonizing physical torture and strategically use it to execute the absolute greatest theatrical performance of my entire life. I shuffled slowly into my dark, quiet study, sat heavily behind my massive mahogany desk, and stared intently at the black telephone for a very long time. I needed to wait patiently until the deep evening hours arrived. I needed Trent to feel the truly crushing, suffocating pressure of his impending violent mob deadline before I generously offered him his miraculous life-saving salvation. I needed his desperate panic to completely override any lingering suspicious caution he might still harbor in his deceitful, arrogant mind. When the tall wooden grandfather clock in the hallway finally chimed 7 times, I slowly picked up the heavy receiver and directly dialed Trent's private personal line. He answered aggressively on the 3rd ring, his sharp voice incredibly tight, with barely suppressed, frantic anxiety. He barked a hostile greeting, clearly expecting another terrifying, threatening call from his violent, unforgiving, underground creditors. I took a very shallow, ragged breath deliberately, letting the genuine, painful exhaustion, deeply rooted in my lungs, carry my fragile voice into a highly pathetic, violently trembling whisper. Trent. I rasped carefully, making absolutely sure my slurred words sounded incredibly weak and utterly thick with total crushing defeat. It is your father. I heard a sharp, panicked intake of breath on the other end of the line, immediately followed by a sudden, sickeningly sweet, highly artificial shift in his deceitful tone. Dad, he said eagerly, pouring fake, sugary concern into every single calculated syllable. How are you feeling tonight? Monica and I have been so incredibly worried about your rapidly declining health and your terrible physical confusion today. I briefly closed my tired eyes willingly, letting the pure, unadulterated hatred fuel my desperate performance. You were right. Son, I murmured softly, deliberately, letting out a weak, rattling, agonizing cough directly into the receiver. You were right about absolutely everything. I am losing my mind. My frail body is completely failing me, and I can no longer fight this terrifying, dark mental confusion. I just desperately want to rest. I want this heavy burden to be completely gone. Bring the legal power of attorney documents. Bring whatever financial transfers you urgently need. I will officially sign absolutely everything over to you entirely. The total silence that instantly followed my total surrender was incredibly heavy and profoundly thick. I could practically hear the greedy, calculating gears rapidly turning in his head as he gleefully realized he had just won the ultimate financial lottery. Oh, Dad. Trent breathed out perfectly, masking his jubilant, triumphant victory behind a thick veil of solemn, dutiful family responsibility. I know this is a terribly difficult, painful decision for you, but it is truly for the absolute best. I will properly take care of absolutely everything. You just focus entirely on resting your tired body. I will drive over to the house right now with the corporate lawyers to finish the paperwork. No, I interrupted immediately, my ragged voice incredibly weak, but suddenly very firm, injecting the exact right amount of stubborn, lingering old pride into the tense conversation. Not quietly here in the dark, like some shameful, hidden family secret. I proudly built Caldwell Logistics from nothing with my bare hands. I poured 40 long years of my blood, my sweat, and my tears into that massive corporate empire. If I am going to finally surrender my throne and permanently hand over my entire personal financial estate, I am going to do it with proper dignity. I am going to do it in the bright light of day. I paused deliberately, actively, letting my painful breathing labor heavily and loudly into the telephone receiver. I want an official emergency meeting of the entire board of directors called for this coming Friday morning. I want the corporate attorneys, the executive vice presidents, and all the major shareholders physically present in the main executive boardroom. I want to look them all directly in the eye, give a proper honorable farewell speech, and publicly pass the powerful torch to my only son. If you truly want my legal signature on those critical documents, Trent, that is my one and only non-negotiable condition. Trent hesitated quietly. I could practically feel his desperate, terrifying panic aggressively warring with his truly monumental, blinding greed. He absolutely needed that massive amount of money immediately to completely pay off the violent mob syndicate by late Friday evening. A public board meeting unfortunately delayed his direct access to my personal trust funds by 48 highly stressful, incredibly dangerous hours. But the strategic, manipulative brilliance of my specific condition was utterly entirely irresistible to a massive narcissist like my treacherous son. A quiet private signature heavily secured in a dark, lonely bedroom could potentially be legally contested later by highly suspicious board members or aggressive federal auditors. But a highly public, deeply emotional, gracefully executed handover occurring directly in front of the entire corporate leadership team would permanently legitimize his absolute executive control forever. It would completely, securely insulate him from any future financial audits or dangerous federal criminal inquiries. It was the absolute perfect, unassailable, flawless cover story for his massive ongoing financial crimes. "I completely understand, Dad." Trent finally replied, his smooth voice dripping with intensely triumphant, greedy satisfaction. "You absolutely deserve a proper, highly honorable, very public farewell. I will contact the senior board members immediately and arrange absolutely everything for Friday morning at exactly 9 o'clock sharp. I will personally have the corporate legal team prepare the final power of attorney files and the complete estate transfer binders. You will not have to worry about a single thing ever again." I thanked him weakly, whispering my love before disconnecting the line. The pathetic facade vanished instantly. I sat perfectly straight in my chair, cold ice freezing over my heart. The massive trap was flawlessly set. Now I just had to simply survive until Friday morning finally arrived. The next 48 hours were an agonizing exercise in endurance. I forced myself to continue wearing the lethally laced timepiece, allowing the heavy metal toxins to steadily seep into my bloodstream to maintain the flawless illusion of my impending death. My joints ached with a deep fire, and my vision occasionally blurred into a sickening haze, but my mind remained incredibly sharp, fueled by the cold promise of absolute justice. I meticulously coordinated every unseen detail with Special Agent Thomas Sterling, ensuring his undercover federal teams were perfectly positioned throughout the city. When Friday morning finally broke, painting the sky in pale shades of gray, I felt a profound sense of peace. The agonizing wait was over. The final act of this treacherous play was officially beginning. I dressed in a tailored, dark charcoal suit that hung loosely on my deteriorating frame, intentionally amplifying my frail appearance. I called a private medical transport service to drive me to the corporate headquarters, demanding a wheelchair for the transition. I wanted my entrance to be a masterclass in vulnerability. The glass and steel facade of the Caldwell Logistics building loomed against the skyline, a monument to 40 years of my relentless sacrifice. As attendants wheeled me through the polished marble lobby, a heavy silence fell over the busy floor. Dozens of loyal employees stopped and openly stared. I saw genuine tears in the eyes of my senior staff. I saw pity, profound sadness, and quiet mourning. I kept my head bowed slightly, my hands resting weakly in my lap, playing the part of the defeated, dying founder perfectly to the end. The elevator ride to the top executive floor felt like a slow ascension to a waiting guillotine, but beneath my trembling exterior, my blood was humming with calculated anticipation. The frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom slid open, revealing the heart of my empire. The room was expansive, anchored by a massive custom-built mahogany table I had personally commissioned 3 decades ago. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, below a stark contrast to the grim atmosphere suffocating the interior space. The entire board of directors was already seated around the polished wood. Some looked at me with genuine sorrow, while others, the newer executives Trent had brought in, completely failed to mask their calculating indifference. They saw me as nothing more than a fading relic, a stubborn obstacle finally being cleared from their progressive path. I allowed the attendant to wheel me directly to the head of the table, the seat of authority I was about to surrender forever. Trent was standing at the far end of the room, incapable of hiding his intense nervous energy. He was bouncing on the heels of his Italian leather shoes. He wore a sharp navy suit, desperately projecting the image of a confident corporate leader. But I could easily see the dark shadows lingering under his eyes, the physical toll of his massive offshore gambling debts, and the terrifying mob deadlines scheduled to crash down on him by sunset. He was a drowning rat, masquerading as a victorious king. He smiled as I was wheeled into position, a sickeningly warm, manufactured expression of filial affection that made my stomach churn with pure disgust. Standing directly behind Trent was Monica. She was absolutely breathtaking and entirely terrifying. She had dressed for a royal coronation, wearing a strikingly elegant black designer dress that screamed of unlimited wealth and untouchable power. A thick necklace of flawless diamonds rested against her collarbone, undoubtedly purchased with the corporate funds her husband had embezzled. She stood with her posture rigidly straight, her chin tilted slightly upward, already acting like the undisputed queen of the massive logistics empire. Her cold, calculating eyes met mine across the long mahogany table, entirely devoid of human empathy. I saw the quiet calculation flashing in her gaze. She was mentally counting the hours until the thallium finally stopped my beating heart. She was already spending the $25 million corporate life insurance payout in her twisted sociopathic mind. Seated directly to Trent's right was Thomas Bradley, the smooth, notoriously corrupt senior corporate counsel. Bradley was a slick, highly unethical legal shark who had quietly facilitated many of Trent's questionable corporate maneuvers over the past 18 months. He possessed the incredibly rare, highly dangerous ability to make highly illicit financial transactions look perfectly acceptable on official corporate paper. Bradley was wearing a smug, satisfied smirk, clearly anticipating a massive, lucrative bonus for officially processing this hostile, treacherous transition of ultimate power. He smoothly reached into his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of densely printed legal documents. He neatly aligned the heavy papers on the polished mahogany table, gently smoothing the crisp edges with his perfectly manicured hands. "These are the final comprehensive power of attorney authorizations, Mr. Caldwell." Thomas Bradley announced, his voice projecting across the silent boardroom with a slippery, theatrical gravitas. In addition to the total transfer of all executive corporate controls and voting shares, these documents legally incorporate the immediate, irrevocable transfer of your entire personal estate, your private trust funds, and all physical property deeds directly into the sole, undisputed custody of your son, Trent Caldwell. This highly comprehensive legal transition will effectively ensure that your magnificent legacy is seamlessly protected and aggressively maintained during your deeply unfortunate, tragic medical decline. The absolute silence in the boardroom was incredibly heavy, practically suffocating the air out of my lungs. I slowly raised my shaking, pale hands, resting them weakly on the cool, polished surface of the mahogany table. I let out a soft, rattling breath, allowing a single manufactured tear to slowly trace its way down my wrinkled cheek. I looked around the large table, meeting the eyes of the quiet, watching directors. Some actively looked away, deeply ashamed to witness the pathetic, unconditional surrender of a giant. Trent confidently stepped forward, smoothly closing the distance between us. He picked up the thick stack of legal documents and gently slid them directly across the smooth wood until they rested right in front of my trembling hands. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his expensive suit jacket and pulled out a heavy, solid gold fountain pen. It was the exact same pen I had proudly gifted to him upon his graduation from university, a beautiful instrument meant to sign honest, honorable contracts. He leaned down, placing his hands firmly on the armrests of my medical wheelchair, trapping me in my seat. His face was only inches from mine. I could clearly smell the sharp, metallic scent of his nervous sweat, completely cutting through his expensive cologne. He gently placed the gold pen directly into my shaking palm, closing my cold fingers around the heavy metal barrel. He flashed a brilliant, triumphant, completely fake smile for the watching board of directors, before dropping his voice into a low, intimate whisper meant strictly for my ears alone. "It is time to rest, Dad," Trent murmured softly, his tone dripping with an arrogant, condescending finality. "You have done more than enough for us. I have finally got it perfectly handled from here." I stared down at the heavy gold fountain pen resting in my open palm. Trent was still leaning over me, his face radiating a sickeningly confident smirk, fully believing he had secured his ultimate victory. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, allowing his arrogant words to hang heavily in the stale air of the boardroom. Then I simply opened my fingers. The solid gold pen slipped from my grasp and plummeted onto the polished mahogany table with a sharp, incredibly loud metallic crack. The sudden violent noise echoed like a gunshot through the massive room. Several board members physically flinched in their expensive leather chairs. Trent blinked, a flash of genuine confusion breaking through his manufactured facade. He instinctively reached out to retrieve the fallen pen, assuming my deteriorating motor skills had finally failed me completely. I gripped the sturdy armrests of my medical wheelchair before his hand could even brush the cold metal. I took a deep, steadying breath, pulling the cold air into my lungs, and pushed myself upward. I ignored the intense burning in my joints and the heavy, lingering nausea brought on by the thallium poisoning. Pure, unadulterated adrenaline flooded my veins, temporarily banishing every single trace of the toxic weakness. I stood up slowly, deliberately, shedding the pathetic illusion of the dying, defeated old man. I straightened my spine, squaring my shoulders until my posture was entirely rigid and towering. I towered over Trent, casting a long, dark shadow across his suddenly trembling form. The entire executive boardroom fell completely, absolutely silent. You could have heard a single pin drop on the thick carpet. The watching directors stared at me with wide, horrified eyes, utterly paralyzed by the impossible sight of a supposedly comatose man suddenly standing with the imposing, terrifying authority of a ruthless titan. Trent stumbled backward, his Italian leather shoes scraping clumsily against the floorboards. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly shade of translucent gray. His mouth opened and closed silently, struggling to comprehend the terrifying reality unfolding right in front of him. "Dad," he finally stammered, his voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. "What are you doing? You need to sit down. You are incredibly sick." "I am exactly the man I have always been." "Trent," I replied. My voice no longer a weak, rattling whisper, but a booming, resonant thunder that shook the very glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. I stared directly into his terrified eyes, letting him feel the full, crushing weight of my absolute fury. "You genuinely believed I was just a blind, pathetic fool. You eagerly confused my unconditional paternal love for terminal stupidity. You thought you could simply waltz into my corporate sanctuary and steal my legacy while I quietly suffocated in the dark." I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored charcoal suit jacket and calmly withdrew a small black multimedia remote control. I did not break eye contact with my trembling son as I raised my arm and pointed the device directly toward the ceiling. I firmly pressed the central button. The massive state-of-the-art corporate projector hummed to life with a low, mechanical whir. The heavy motorized screen slowly descended over the far wall of the boardroom, casting a bright rectangular glow across the mahogany table. Thomas Bradley, the corrupt corporate lawyer, frantically gathered his fraudulent power of attorney documents, instinctively sensing the catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. Instead of the sanitized executive transition slides Trent had proudly prepared to legitimize his hostile takeover, the massive screen flickered and illuminated with the crisp, stark contrast of infrared security footage. It was the hidden camera recording from my private living room, captured just a few nights prior. The high-definition video clearly displayed Trent and Monica lounging casually on my sofa, comfortably drinking my rare vintage scotch. The highly sensitive audio transmitters flooded the quiet boardroom with perfect, undeniable clarity. The collected board of directors watched in absolute paralyzed horror as the digital ghost of my son began his frantic, pathetic confession. Trent's desperate, whining voice echoed off the walls, clearly detailing how he had selfishly blown exactly $15 million of critical corporate operational funds on disastrous underground cryptocurrency bets. The executives gasped audibly as the recording revealed the massive illegal gambling debts Trent had subsequently acquired, and the terrifying mob-connected lenders who were actively threatening to violently seize the logistics company assets by Friday evening. The pristine, highly sanitized corporate illusion Trent had desperately tried to maintain was instantaneously, completely incinerated, but the absolute worst was yet to come. The video continued playing, delivering the most brutal, unforgivable twist of the entire treacherous plot. Monica leaned forward on the massive screen, her voice cold and completely devoid of human empathy. The audio broadcasted her chilling complaint about my surprising physical resilience. She explicitly ordered Trent to aggressively increase the lethal dosage on the transdermal watchpad. She coldly described the heavy metal thallium, boasting about how the highly toxic poison would rapidly collapse my nervous system and easily mimic natural organ failure without raising any medical suspicions. The reaction in the boardroom was instantaneous and entirely visceral. Several senior directors physically recoiled, covering their mouths in pure shock and revulsion. One of the executive vice presidents muttered a quiet prayer under his breath. They were not just watching an arrogant executive violently mismanage corporate funds. They were actively bearing witness to a calculated, cold-blooded, and entirely premeditated murder plot, discussed with the casual indifference of planning a weekend vacation. The recording reached its devastating climax. Trent's digital voice filled the room, eagerly outlining his final treacherous endgame. Once he signs the power of attorney, we toss him in a nursing home and let the thallium finish the job, the recorded Trent explained greedily. As soon as his heart stops, the $25 million key man corporate life insurance policy pays out to me. We clear the debts, liquidate what is left, and disappear to Europe. The ultimate sickening betrayal was finally laid bare for the entire world to see. My life, my decades of relentless sacrifice was literally worth nothing more than a $25 million payout to my only child. I clicked the black remote control a second time. The infrared video vanished instantly, replaced by the highly detailed multi-page forensic toxicology report from the private laboratory. The massive screen brightly displayed the lethal levels of heavy metal detected in the watch casing, complete with the official chemical breakdown of the weaponized hydrogel and the certified signature of the lead toxicologist. The undeniable concrete scientific proof of their attempted assassination glared down at them, entirely irrefutable and absolutely damning. Trent collapsed heavily into a leather chair, his entire body shaking violently as the inescapable reality of his total destruction finally caught up to him. He buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out a pathetic, muffled sob of pure terror. Monica, however, reacted with the instinct of a cornered, desperate predator. Her meticulously crafted mask of elegant, untouchable superiority completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. She realized in a fraction of a second that her glamorous, wealthy future was entirely dead, and she was going to spend the rest of her life in a federal prison cell. She let out a harsh, guttural scream of pure panic and lunged aggressively across the boardroom. Her expensive designer heels slipped on the polished floor as she frantically scrambled toward the multimedia console, desperately trying to reach the thick, black power cord to manually disconnect the projector from the wall. She wanted to violently kill the presentation, to somehow stop the horrific truth from continuing to broadcast her undeniable guilt to the horrified audience. "Freeze!" I commanded, my voice cracking like a physical whip across the room. The sheer absolute authority behind my single word hit her like a solid brick wall. Monica stopped dead in her tracks, her hand hovering mere inches away from the electrical outlet. She slowly turned her head to look at me, her eyes wide with a profound, consuming terror she had never experienced before in her entire life. She was completely frozen, trapped under the burning weight of my unforgiving glare. The trap had flawlessly, permanently slammed shut. "You are right, Trent." My absolute steady voice boomed across the vast expanse of the large boardroom, loudly echoing with 40 long years of unquestioned corporate authority. "I am finally resting today, but you are going to prison." The heavy frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom did not simply open. They violently burst apart. A highly coordinated flood of armed tactical agents representing both the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Chicago Police Department surged into the room. Special Agent Thomas Sterling led the aggressive charge, his weapon drawn, and his tactical vest clearly identifying his absolute federal authority. The sheer overwhelming force of the sudden raid instantly shattered the fragile, terrified silence that had gripped the corporate directors. "Federal agents, nobody move. Keep your hands exactly where we can see them," Sterling roared, his commanding voice cutting through the rising panic. The senior board members immediately scrambled backward violently, pushing their expensive leather chairs away from the long mahogany table. They pressed their backs flat against the cold floor-to-ceiling windows, desperately trying to physically distance themselves from the unfolding criminal catastrophe. Thomas Bradley, the corrupt corporate counsel, practically fell out of his seat. He raised his perfectly manicured hands high into the air, his face pale with sudden terrifying realization that his lucrative illegal career was permanently over. Trent did not even have the necessary time to process the violent intrusion. Two heavily armored federal agents forcefully grabbed him by his tailored shoulders. They brutally slammed him face first against the polished surface of my custom mahogany table. The sickening thud of his skull hitting the hard wood echoed loudly. His arms were violently wrenched behind his back, and the sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists sounded like the ultimate final gavel drop of his privileged life. Monica fought back with the wild, unhinged ferocity of a cornered animal, as a female officer lunged forward to apprehend her. Monica violently swung her arms, her manicured nails raking across the air. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that tore through the boardroom, a sound so entirely devoid of her usual elegant sophistication that it barely sounded human. Her perfect, untouchable facade was entirely, completely destroyed. The expensive black designer dress tore slightly at the shoulder as two officers wrestled her aggressively to the ground. They forced her face against the plush corporate carpet, securely fastening her hands behind her back. "Get your filthy hands off of me!" Monica shrieked, thrashing her head wildly from side to side. Her flawless makeup was heavily smeared with angry tears, and the thick necklace of flawless diamonds dug painfully into her collarbone as she struggled against the unyielding federal restraints. "I am Monica Caldwell. You have absolutely no legal right to touch me. I demand to call my private lawyers immediately. This is a massive, unforgivable mistake. The only mistake you made was attempting to chemically execute a federal witness," Agent Sterling replied coldly, standing directly over her struggling form. He did not offer her a single ounce of professional sympathy. He expertly read her constitutional rights, his crisp, authoritative words entirely drowning out her frantic, high-pitched protests. Trent, however, had completely abandoned any lingering pretense of arrogant defiance. As the tactical agents roughly hauled him up from the wooden table, his knees buckled beneath his weight. He dropped heavily onto the floor, falling directly to his knees right in front of my medical wheelchair. He was openly, uncontrollably sobbing. The thick, arrogant pride that had previously fueled his treacherous corporate takeover had completely evaporated instantly, replaced by the raw, pathetic terror of a deeply cowardly man finally facing the devastating consequences of his own horrific actions. "Dad, please," Trent begged, his voice cracking and breaking into a high, desperate whine. Large, heavy tears streamed down his face, dripping onto his sharp navy suit. "Please, you have to stop them. You have to tell them this is a terrible misunderstanding. I was absolutely desperate. Those underground lenders were going to physically kill me, Dad. They were going to violently dismantle everything you built. I only did this to safely protect our massive family empire. You have to show me some mercy. I am your only son. I looked down at the weeping, trembling man kneeling in front of me. I searched my own heart, looking for even a tiny, lingering fragment of paternal affection. I searched for the warm, unconditional love that had previously motivated me to blindly trust him with my entire legacy. But there was absolutely nothing left. The thallium poisoning had physically ravaged my body, but his profound sociopathic betrayal had permanently, completely severed my soul from his. My eyes were entirely devoid of any human warmth as I stared at his pathetic, weeping face. "You did not aggressively protect our family empire, Trent," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, terrifying emptiness. "You selfishly tried to burn it to the ground, to comfortably finance your own arrogant, greedy failures. You actively plotted to violently steal my life, completely secure, in the arrogant assumption that your bloodline granted you total immunity from basic human morality." I slowly reached across my body with my trembling right hand. I carefully unclasped the heavy, expensive luxury watch strapped securely to my left wrist. The thick leather band slid through my fingers. The highly lethal transdermal pad, deeply saturated with the toxic heavy metal that had been slowly shutting down my internal organs for an entire week, was still firmly hidden securely inside the custom casing. I held the metallic timepiece in the air for a brief, tense moment, letting the terrified board of directors clearly see the exact weapon my son had eagerly deployed. I opened my hand and let the watch fall. It dropped directly onto the plush carpet, landing right between Trent's trembling knees with a dull, heavy thud. "I am officially returning my Father's Day gift," I told him, my tone as sharp and unforgiving as a winter storm. "I highly suggest you hold on to it. It will undoubtedly be the very last physical reminder you will ever possess of the incredibly generous father you so foolishly attempted to murder." Trent stared blankly at the toxic watch resting on the floor, his entire body shuddering with loud, violent gasps. He finally realized that his elegant words and his desperate, tearful pleas held absolutely no remaining power. He was completely, irrevocably dead to me. Special Agent Sterling stepped forward, firmly gripping Trent by the back of his suit collar. He hauled my weeping son to his feet forcefully, pushing him toward the shattered, frosted glass doors of the boardroom. The armed officers mirrored his strict, aggressive movements, firmly dragging a still, screaming, thrashing Monica right behind him. The corporate lawyers and terrified board members completely pressed themselves against the high walls, eagerly clearing a wide, unobstructed path for the sudden criminal exodus. As they were violently marched out of my physical sight forever, the crushing weight of the toxic poison finally felt significantly lighter. My vast corporate empire was completely safe, and my unforgiving justice was perfectly delivered right now. 6 months later, the chilling winds of Chicago felt refreshingly crisp against my face as I walked down the bustling downtown avenue. The heavy, suffocating fog that had once clouded my mind and ravaged my body was completely gone. The lethal thallium had been entirely purged from my system through rigorous medical treatments and relentless physical therapy. My strength had fully returned, and my vision was remarkably clear. Trent and Monica were no longer my terrifying burden. They were currently residing in a maximum security federal penitentiary, both serving mandatory sentences of 20 years for their brutal convictions of attempted murder and massive wire fraud. The highly publicized trial had been a brief, devastating spectacle, ending with their absolute ruin. I had legally, irrevocably disinherited Trent from my entire estate, ensuring he would never touch a single penny of the legacy he had so ruthlessly tried to steal. I successfully steered Caldwell Logistics back from the dangerous brink of financial ruin, stabilizing the corporate accounts and completely eliminating the underground mob debts he had cowardly incurred. The company was stronger than ever, but my personal perspective on life had fundamentally shifted. I stopped in front of a beautiful, highly upscale storefront, boasting gleaming glass windows and elegant gold lettering. I pushed open the heavy mahogany door, a warm, inviting bell chiming softly above my head. The rich scent of fine leather and freshly brewed espresso filled the immaculate room. Behind the pristine glass counters filled with magnificent, intricate timepieces stood Victor Abramov. 6 months ago, Victor was just an incredibly observant jeweler working out of a tiny, cramped subway booth. He was the brilliant, meticulous man who had first noticed the microscopic tampering on my watch casing, ultimately saving my life. I smiled warmly as he looked up from his workbench. I had fully financed this magnificent new storefront for him, as a profound, silent thank you for his incredible vigilance and unparalleled honesty. Victor wiped his hands on a clean cloth and stepped around the polished counter, returning my genuine smile with a firm, respectful handshake. We sat down together in 2 plush leather chairs near the large front window, sharing a hot cup of dark coffee while watching the busy city rush by outside. We did not need to explicitly discuss the terrifying darkness of the past or the brutal betrayal that had originally brought us together. We were simply 2 men quietly enjoying a peaceful morning, sharing a profound, unspoken understanding of the absolute true value of time. Every single ticking second was no longer a terrifying countdown to a tragic demise, but a precious, hard-earned victory. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the rich taste of the coffee and the comforting warmth of the morning sun against my skin. I had successfully torn down my own empire to completely expose the treacherous wolves hiding inside my own home, and in doing so, I had finally reclaimed my own life. I looked at the beautiful watches displayed around us, listening to their steady, rhythmic heartbeats. They were no longer dangerous weapons of silent assassination, but beautiful testaments to survival resilience and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The painful scars of my son's horrific betrayal would likely never heal entirely, but they no longer defined my daily existence. I was alive, I was completely free, and my future was entirely my own to write. I smiled again, letting the quiet atmosphere wash over me. The vast logistics company was now operating flawlessly without the dark shadow of corruption. I had appointed a trustworthy executive board to handle the daily operations. My legacy was entirely secure. I took another long, relaxing sip of the excellent espresso. The bitter past was officially behind me, and the bright morning held infinite promise. I had survived the absolute worst, and now I was truly ready to live again. Blood does not automatically grant someone the right to your unyielding trust, nor does it excuse malice disguised as love. As parents, we spend our lives building a fortress to protect our children, but we must never let love blind us to the wolves standing inside our own gates. Betrayal from within is the most toxic poison, silently destroying you while you refuse to see the signs. True family is defined by respect, loyalty, and actions, not just a shared last name. Never be afraid to tear down your empire if it means surviving the people trying to steal it. Have you ever discovered a shocking betrayal from someone you trusted with your life? How did you fight back? Drop your story in the comments below. If Harrison's revenge satisfied you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who truly needs it.